You didn't miss the Scars of Corruption video. Jane is just mostly chronologically before that, so I wanted to cover it first. Overall, I think that Jane is the most well-written chapter in Banning K's Jeff the Killer universe, and also kind of the most useless, except for maybe Lou. Like, the least really happens to develop the world in this chapter. It's mostly about a character that you already know and then never see again after this chapter. That's especially glaring because BK released this chapter right after Scars of Corruption, which basically built the JDK universe as BK has it set up, and really drives the story light years past where Jeff kills his family in the first chapter. As usual, I'm going to be spoiling all of it, so go read this monster for yourself if you want to before listening to this. Also, sorry for taking so long to get to this. It's a huge, intricate story and I've been busy. So Jane opens up on like this group of characters who are filming like this TV reenactment of Jane's experience at the Jeff the Killer house, which this chapter covers later on. After filming the reenactment, the two actors have this car scene where they discuss Jane the Killer's backstory and stuff. The scene is pretty redundant because it establishes a lot about Jane that this chapter is going to cover in detail anyway, and these two actors die and then are never seen again, so their characters being developed here doesn't really matter or add anything. In the next scene, Derek Reynolds interviews Jane in her house. This is also the scene where we're introduced to Russell Hardwick, who's Jane's lawyer and bodyguard for some reason. The story strongly implies that Hardwick is somehow involved in Sawyer's whole like brainwashing cult, more on that later, but like many things, his arc is never brought around, so what was the point of that? By the way, I feel like this opening section is really just a teaser for another story that BK never wrote about Derek Reynolds. There's a vague allusion to Derek's experience at the hands of the Cult of the Red Star, which is a story I'd kind of rather read than this one, honestly. Anyway, after the interview, there's this whole scene where Jane kind of like comes on to Derek basically, but then Hardwick barges in on them and acts like a total cockblock. The scene isn't like important and doesn't come back like anything else. I just thought it was funny. While Derek is making the return drive to New Orleans, he calls his friend Claire Nobles to explain the Jane interview to her, and that's where the story really begins. I'm gonna kind of gloss over most of Jane's like formative years in this chapter because like a lot of things, they're never mentioned again, they never really come back and don't have any major impact on anything past this story. Basically, Jane was born to Drake and Elaine Arkansas, a wealthy investor couple living in Dallas, Texas. There's a long, albeit well-written segment here about Elaine's mom dying of cancer because their family doctor thought that her complaints of pain were just her like underhandedly asking for like Percocets or something. The exploration of Jane's and her father Drake's grief over Elaine's death is pretty well handled. It's honestly kind of working for me. Also, having Elaine's doctor be this like corrupt, like pill-pushing drug dealer basically is like a good thematic mirroring for all of the corruption in Mandeville that Jane's life is like impacted by later on in the story, so I like that sort of narrative mirroring there. Jane and Drake moved to Mandeville, Louisiana after Elaine's death. For some reason, Maxwell Hayden offers to sell his shares of his company to Drake in the aftermath of the whole scandal thing. I'm not exactly sure why this happens. The story never really like implies any previous connection between them. I guess it's just sort of that like business world thing where like people find each other on like Indeed.com or whatever. Also, this isn't really important, but Jane makes this like morbid joke about how they're not gonna like move right into the Jeff the Killer house, and then the next scene immediately cuts to them moving into the Jeff the Killer house. It's like a weird like comedy smash cut, and the rest of the story doesn't have this tone, so I just thought that that was funny as well. One day, Jane is home alone and she gets the idea to make a YouTube channel documenting her experience living in the famous Jeff the Killer house. She posts a video of like the master bedroom to YouTube and then decides to walk to the video store where that whole inciting incident happened in the first story. The video store clerk like tells her not to ask anything about Jeff the Killer, but then goes on to like immediately spill all the tea on like Jeff's Killers, which is like this like group of kids who like follow Jeff religiously and think he's like the best thing ever basically. She also tells Jane exactly where to find them on Shortcut Road. I guess while Jane is walking out of the store, the clerk is like, oh, don't go there, they're dangerous. So like, hey, she tried sorta. Jane like immediately goes to St. Tammany Parish where Shortcut Road is. And for some reason, Jeff's Killers, that like group of fanboys that I just mentioned, they like attack her as soon as she arrives there. Which like in Scars of Corruption, there's this whole like interview scene with Jeff's Killers where like they talk to the interviewers and they like explain why they're there, and they're not like outwardly hostile to the interviewers or anything. So like the scene doesn't exactly make sense, especially since these people don't know who Jane is and they don't have any reason to like think that she's anything to worry about or to like pay attention to. Like, for all they know, she could be like one of them or something, so this makes zero sense. Just as like an aside, in case anyone wants to point this out, I get that Jeff's killers are supposedly like under Dr. Sawyer's like mind control. That comes way later in the series. It doesn't really matter here, but I don't think that that's why they attacked Jane either, because at this point in the story, Dr. Sawyer also doesn't know who Jane is, also doesn't have any reason to like care about her, I guess. So Jane escapes Jeff's killers and Shortcut Road pretty easily because she's in a car and is armed, and they're like a bunch of teenage kids wearing like very obstructive costumes with like contact lenses and like fake knives and stuff like that. She goes to the Mandeville police station, and the chief of police there, Mitchell Hardy, I don't know if that actually matters that I named him. Anyway, she goes there and he tries to like bully her into, I guess, dropping her complaint about Shortcut Road or something. It's not exactly clear, and it's never made clear because Drake and Hardwick bust in on their conversation before he can like accuse Jane of like smoking pot or something like that, which the story never like alludes to her doing. So like, why? Hardwick says something about trying to get Jane to like not complain about Jeff's killers, but it's like, you're the chief of police. Like, if someone's complaining about something, you don't want to listen to them. Can't you just like not listen to them? I'm not a cop, I don't know. Also, and I know I keep saying this, but the police also don't know who Jane is at this point. They don't know that she's like making a YouTube documentary about like the Jeff the Killer extravaganza or whatever. They don't have any reason to like care about her either, or to try and like intimidate her out of anything. And Hardwick says something about the chief of police wanting Jeff's killers to just like go away or whatever if no one like pays attention to them, which not only is that not how police works in my very limited understanding, but also that doesn't make sense either. Anyway, moving on to Hardwick, I feel like now is a good time as any to talk about how he is one of the most frustrating characters in the series, because this whole series kind of hints at him, like I mentioned before, like being involved in Sawyer's like brainwashing cult or something. Like, the story implies that he knew that all of this was going to happen somehow. Like, he knew that the Arkansas were going to move to Mandeville, and he knew that Jane was going to be like accosted by the chief of police. But the story, it never explains how he knew any of that or how any of it really serves like his ultimate goal. The point is, I wish that the series offered more of like a satisfactory explanation for like who Hardwick is and what he's trying to accomplish. But whatever, this is the series that doesn't do that for like anything, so what do I expect? So anyway, Hardwick has this plan that I sort of alluded to before. After Jane gets attacked on Shortcut Road, Hardwick lays out this whole like grand scheme to basically make Shortcut Road in St. Tammany Parish this like municipality of the city property, which it's not at this point in the story. The whole reason that Jeff's killers gather there is because the land isn't owned by Mandeville, and it's technically not really like owned by anybody, so no one is able to like serve as a complainant to remove Jeff's killers legally from St. Tammany Parish. Hardwick's plan also relies on Drake becoming the majority shareholder of Maxwell Hayden's previous company, of which Drake is already owning of 35% of the shares at this point, so I don't understand like what difference it makes. I mean, I'm not also a stockbroker, so it could just be that I don't understand this well enough. So Drake basically shoulders the costs out of pocket to remove all of these like condemned houses from Shortcut Road, and also remove Jeff's killers from that area as well. Which again, the story implies that Hardwick knew that the chief of police was going to harass Jane at the police station. That whole sequence of events led to Hardy kind of being in Hardwick's pocket. This is really annoying because their names are so similar, it's hard not to get them confused. Point is, none of this would have really been able to happen if the police chief hadn't like verbally assaulted Jane in the police station, because it gave Hardwick the leverage he needed for this whole plan to happen, which again just makes it feel like Hardwick somehow knew all of this was coming, which makes no sense and is never brought up again either, so like what was the point of that? Once Drake goes public with this plan though, Jane starts receiving these like creepy, harassing phone calls at their house, but only when she's there, and only when she's there by herself, which is a legitimately creepy phenomenon in my opinion, so I think that was pretty well written. Eventually these like phone calls and stuff, it's implied that they like sort of extend to Drake as well, and that he's also getting them, and they like wear on his character in a way that they don't wear on Jane's, and also in a way that his character thus far doesn't really seem to match up with. Like, he's sort of presented as like this tough guy or whatever, so it's weird how like these random phone calls make him like into this paranoid like drinker basically. Also, it's weird to me how Hardwick never like investigates the source of the phone calls that Jane and Drake are receiving. Like, it kind of makes it seem like he's doing it, or like he's like behind it, or like complicit somehow, but like that doesn't really make sense either, because it's like antithetical to what his goal seems to be. Even stranger, like narratively, is how Jane points out that this project to clear Shortcut Road kind of gets stalled right before it's supposed to be completed, but like the story nor Jane never really give like a reason as to why it got stalled. This all comes to a head though when the group of anonymous callers show up in person at Jane's house one night. They like kill Drake right in front of her and then tie her up and set the house on fire. apparently with the intent to like let her burn to death in it. And I say apparently because one of them like brandishes a knife and like is about to like stab her or something, which if that's the case, like why did you set the house on fire unless you were going to like get rid of the evidence or something? But that doesn't really make sense either. It's weird to me that they managed to kill Drake without restraining him, but then they need to like knock Jane out and like tie her up and then like kill her when the house is already on fire. Like it seems like redundant and not like a super efficient plan, and it like gives Hardwick just enough time to like show up and like save Jane, but then not even try to save Drake for some reason, which just feeds into like his confusing character motivations. And like I get that BK doesn't have to like lay out his character's intentions in a way that are just like crystal clear without any kind of ambiguity, but it doesn't quite make sense to me how Hardwick takes all of these like contradictory actions that seem to like get in the way of his own goals. Like it seems like he wants the clear shortcut road because he was the one that came up with the plan and is like really hardcore pressuring Jane and Drake to like follow through with it. But then judging by the fact that he also like showed up at their house like right after Drake died and right before Jane was about to, like it seems like he was in on that as well, and the fact that he didn't trace the phone calls to them makes it seem like he was like behind them or like involved, but the phone calls were trying to stop Drake and Jane from clearing Shortcut Road, so that doesn't really make sense either. Also, again, none of this like comes back around. Like none of the preceding chapters after this even like really mention Jane outside of saying that she hijacked some interview or something, and Hardwick never returns as a character like to this entire series. He's only in this chapter and then he's never mentioned again. So like I know I keep saying this and I keep harping on it, but what was the point? By the way, with Drake's dying breath, he tells Jane to open up box 9 of like a bank safe basically that he had reserved that only her name could open. And big surprise, like everything else, you never find out what was in that box. He never tells you. She never goes back to it. The story never goes back to it. It doesn't matter. The story informs you that Jane told Derek during the interview what was in the box, which means that it would have been like public information like a week or two later when that interview aired. But the story never tells you that because the interview doesn't air because the two actors from the beginning of the story got murdered after filming it. So that's the Jane chapter of the JDK BK universe. I think that the story would function much better if there was like a Jane part 2 or something to like contextualize all of this like backstory and like push it forward, if that makes sense. Like if all of what you just read in this chapter kind of came to bear in like the post Stars of Corruption, if that makes sense, then that would make the story function better for me and it would kind of sit better. The story like somewhat deepens like the lore of the JDK universe or whatever, but like I mentioned before, it's not really like in any meaningful way because a lot of what you find out here is just stuff that you already knew from Stars of Corruption. I already knew that Shortcut Road was this place where Jeff's killers like to like hang out or whatever, and I already knew that Jane was in Mandeville because her father had been murdered due to the corruption and due to him trying to remove Jeff's killers from Shortcut Road. Like I didn't need a 2-hour plus backstory on all of the things that I already knew from Scars that I could have just extrapolated on my own. I actually think Scars of Corruption did a better job providing this backstory rather than this chapter like spelling it all out, honestly. I would have much rather this chapter pick up where Scars of Corruption left off, but like from Jane's perspective. Then she could have like done some stuff to progress the story forward herself, or like, I mean, the chapter could have progressed the story forward itself like from her perspective. She wouldn't have necessarily had to like move it herself. I guess she could have, it doesn't really matter, that's not my point. And then the story could have like returned to Dalton Bradshaw's perspective dealing in the aftermath of Agent Lyman's murder or something like that, and that would have made more sense than like this. That said, I think this chapter makes like a better direct sequel to the first Jeff the Killer story. So like if for some reason you haven't read this whole series and you're just watching these videos without reading them, I would recommend like reading the first chapter and then like reading this chapter, like the Jane chapter, and then like coming back to Scars of Corruption after you've like finished all of that like backstory reading, if you're gonna read it at all, which it's not super important, honestly. Unfortunately, you'll kind of notice a trend of this with every chapter after the Disturbingly Cruel. Like it eventually comes back into focus in the last chapter, but a lot of the preceding chapters are like Lou's backstory or like Randy's backstory. Like BK will do this thing where he'll like introduce a chapter that actually like furthers the story, and then rather than like following that up, he'll like introduce another chapter that like goes over what one of the characters has been through since the first JDK chapter happened. Considering that Scars of Corruption pretty much kind of indirectly filled you in on where every character ended up after where every character ended up after the first JDK, it's just kind of like redundant. Like it just feels like a lot of filler, and really like each character's backstory chapter or whatever, like it only adds any kind of value if you read it before you read Scars of Corruption, which is insane to me because Scars of Corruption is the second chapter in this monolith, and everything else that I just listed, including this chapter that I just talked about, was written after and like published after Scars of Corruption. So this is all just, again, it's kind of like filler basically. Anyway, I don't want to not give credit to the story where it's due, I guess. Jane's relationship with her parents feels pretty authentic. Her and her dad's way of dealing with Elaine's death and like the grief of all of that feels like believable and like touching. Like I mentioned, Derek's backstory that gets hinted at the beginning and then never developed, like that was a really interesting kind of thing to hint at. Like I would like to read a story about that if he ever writes one. Hint, hint. Not that he's ever gonna watch these. Like I mentioned, that whole storyline with like the corrupt doctor that gets put away because he put Elaine on the pills and that's how she died. Like that was a really good like thematic echo of like Jane's future of dealing with town corruption or whatever. I mean, as like a body of work on its own, this chapter actually stands like really well. Like it functions really well as like a standalone story. It looks so weird against the backdrop of like everything else that the story is about because of the way it like steps back chronologically and then doesn't step forward in any like really important way. Like there's like a little bit at the beginning and a little bit at the end that are like sort of important to future chapters, but like even then those like plot beats are only like mentioned in passing in the future anyway, so it feels kind of useless. If I were just looking at the story on its own without like the rest of the Jeff the Killer universe, I would give this like a 7 out of 10 skeletons, I think. As it stands, like being part of this universe that it's in, I would give it like 5.5. If it wasn't obvious by now, I'm going to be covering like the other character chapters next rather than covering Scars of Corruption because they're sort of chronologically what like happens next, and that's kind of what I do on this channel, at least ever since Pen Pal. I'm going to do the Lou chapter next, which don't bother reading it, you can just watch my video about it, it'll be out soon, and I'll cover the plot a lot faster than the story itself does. Anyway, thank you so much for watching.